Hello everyone, my name is James L. Haddi and I'm a research resident at Oregon Health and Sciences University, in addition to being a surgical resident at Florida Atlantic University. My talk today is about our crisis ventilator and its comparison to currently available technologies. Nearly 1 year ago, during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a growing concern that the sudden increase in the number of patients who required ventilator support would outstretch the number of patients that we could provide ventilators for. Attempts to increase the production were limited by raw material shortages. Our device, the crisis ventilator, was created as a gas-powered resuscitator in response to this. The simple concept being that a 3D printed ventilator could be produced on-site using readily available materials. It consists of 12 individually 3D printed parts, which can be made on a fused deposition modeling hobby-level 3D printer, in addition to a silicone membrane and a spring that are readily available during the worst stages of the pandemic. One question for us, however, was how would this device compare to currently available technologies on the market? In order to assess how our device compares to currently existing technology, we took 3 of our 3D printed ventilators and 3 go-to vents by Fortran Medical. The go-to vent is a gas-powered resuscitator which is FDA approved and has a quite similar mechanism of function to our device. These were connected, as shown in this experimental setup, to a Fluke VT650 gas-powered resuscitator in addition to a Michigan test lung. Airway tracings were obtained over the course of 2 minutes along with breath level data. First, we set up a healthy adult lung with a normal airway resistance in accordance with manufactured guidelines. Tidal volumes to mimic a 6 to 8 cc per kilogram for a 70 kilogram predicted body weight male were obtained. We then transitioned the lungs to mimic either a tension pneumothorax or a bronchospasm in accordance with manufacturer guidelines. Once the changes in the experimental setup were made, there were no further changes in the ventilator settings so that we could see how the sudden change in a patient's clinical status may affect the ventilator performance. In addition, ARDS lung models were used with a compliance of 20 milliliters per centimeter of water in accordance with currently available literature for a severe ARDS model. We compared the minute ventilation for each device. Minute ventilation was chosen as it is the product of respiratory rate and tidal volume, and thus any changes in either of these parameters would likely reflect a change in the minute ventilation. Both devices were able to provide an adequate tidal volume and respiratory rate, and thus minute ventilation for both ARDS and healthy adult lungs. It is interesting to note that the go-to vent had a much wider range of respiratory rates that would function continuously in an ARDS model without stalling, thus explaining the wide variation in the minute ventilation as shown on this graph. When transitioning both devices to bronchospasm, the sudden increase in airway resistance resulted in the large majority of devices stalling. Only a handful of tests resulted in continuous performance. This is in accordance with currently existing data for the go-to ventilator. When transitioning to tension pneumothorax, however, we noted that both ventilators decreased their tidal volume but increased the respiratory rate in such a way to preserve minute ventilation. This is also something that has been shown in the literature with the go-to ventilator in the past. It is worth noting that both of our ventilators performed similarly in the same clinical scenarios. To us, this suggests that our ventilator may serve as a 3D printed option in the setting of another crisis or another respiratory pandemic where current ventilator supply is inadequate. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak today. I would be happy to answer any questions that you have.